I'll start this going.
Yeah, do you have like a streaming link? I can just update it on Twitter, or we could just post it on the comments.
Going. It should be this. Just posted in the chat. Do you want to just verify?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. So yeah, why don't you go ahead and introduce the speaker and we'll get going.
Yeah. So yeah, so in the seminar series, we're excited to welcome Shubham Tulsiani. He's a research scientist at FAIR and a soon-to-be prof at CMU. He did his PhD from UC Berkeley, advised by Jitendra. And he's also won a Best Paper Award at CUPR 2015 for his work on single image 3D reconstruction. And yeah, we're really looking forward to hearing you talk. Glad to host you.
Yeah, thanks for having me over. It's great to be virtually here or there. I don't know what's the right phrase to use. And yeah, today I'm not really going to talk about 3D reconstruction, more about how do we interact in the real physical world or go towards better interacting in the real physical world. And before I start, I think feel free to keep this informal, like just stop me, speak up if there are any questions. I don't mind if hard questions are recorded on YouTube. I might not be able to see you raise hands or anything, so just please feel free to speak up if you ever have any questions. Yeah, so with that, let's get started. So sort of all of us working in robotics or more generally any subfield of AI have had this more or less dream goal, right? That we want to be able to build intelligent agents such as this robot that I've taken from the picture Wally, which can go and interact in diverse environments and do diverse different things. So for example, maybe I'd want to have this sort of an agent in my house such that it can do a lot of mundane daily tasks for me. For example, I might want this agent to make coffee for me or clean my living room or kitchen for me. And for example, if I asked it to make coffee and it doesn't really, maybe my house is out of milk, this, hopefully the same robot with the same capabilities should be able to go outside and buy a cup of coffee for me from a particular shop. And both of these examples that I've given to you are very mundane, daily life, non-exciting things that all of us do repeatedly. But to be able to do these kind of diverse things, possibly in new environments, this robot needs to be able to understand the world and do sort of very different basic things. For example, it needs to understand where people might be walking, what are free spaces, where's the door to this particular cafe that I'm showing here, what's maybe the shape of a chair if it needs to pull out a chair for someone to sit on, for example. And so towards this more or less grand goal that we have in AI, that is to build intelligent agents that can do diverse things in diverse environments, the main question obviously is, what is it that we as researchers can do to get there or make steps towards this grand goal? And sort of even beginning from the very early days of the field, even if we go back to the Dartmouth workshop and sort of look at what is it that can take us there, there has been this very clear distinction or this very clear idea that any such agents needs to have at least two fundamental capabilities. One is that of perception, that is, this agent should be able to understand whatever it is that is seen. And second, it should have the ability to then interact with the world. That is, it should be able to pick up the coffee cup or clean the table or act to accomplish whatever goal it has in mind. And if we think of both of these tasks, the task of perception and task of interaction, as something being separate, then we've actually made a remarkable amount of progress in each of these independently. For example, there's sort of a thriving computer vision community where we have made sort of enormous strides in building systems that are capable of, for example, just to cite the canonical success of computer vision, we can show it any arbitrary image And it can very well classify what it is seeing in that image. For example, the image on the left is of a mite, or the one on the right is of a container ship. And if we are to talk of interaction, then again, we have made a remarkable amount of progress. We have developed these robots that have essentially revolutionized how manufacturing happens, how certain warehouses operate, by automating things like picking or assembling cars even. So we've really made a lot of progress in perception as well as in interaction. But I'd argue that both of these independent successes haven't quite gotten us to building these intelligent agents that can act in general environments. And perhaps the reason for that is we've been studying both these tasks of perception and interaction in their own relatively narrow domains for their own sake. For example, the success that we have had in perception has been by focusing or reducing the task of perception to basically naming and labeling pixels. For example, one can see this entire image and name that this is a mite, or even perhaps label the pixels that belong to the mite, and so on. And when we are considering interaction, we have essentially abstracted out or simplified perception by tackling this in controlled environments where we've, based on perfect we have installed enough sensors such that the task of perception has been more or less simplified. And what I want to argue today is to be able to go towards this goal of having agents that act in general environments, we should really break this barrier, not study perception for perception's sake, or not study interaction in settings where perception is pretty simple, but rather study both of them together in settings that are a bit more general. And so first, what I'd want to talk about is that we should change the task that we have defined in perception to not focus on labeling and naming pixels, but rather study tasks in perception that are more directly useful for being able to interact. And one question one might have is, what is the role of perceptions, or what should the role of perception be, such that whatever we perceive is useful for interacting? And to answer that, we can look at what is it that the interaction community has accomplished over the decades. So we have built really, really great tools that can tell us how to act, given some sort of an understanding of the world. So given physical models that, let's say, specify where an object is, we have developed tools that can plan, for example, planners like MPC, etc., can tell us how to plan to accomplish certain goals or how to act given an understanding of the physical world. And so with this view, I'd argue that the role of perception can be to take us from some sort of sensor input, given some raw visual data, to construct some mental models of how the world is, such that these predicted world models can now also be useful to go towards actions using the kind of tools that we have developed in the interaction community over the decades. And so with this in mind, I'd argue that the role of perception should be to take some sort of sensory input and tell us how the underlying world is and how might it change if we act in it. For example, a physical representation of the world should also capture the fact that if there's a certain block on the table, I can push it, or I can, if I push the block below, then the block at the bottom will fall, and so on. And so with this in mind, we want to be able to go from some sort of sensor input, such as images, to some model of the underlying world. And we really need to be able to learn this function, that some function that takes us from sensor input to underlying physical models, because we want to be able to make this prediction in novel scenarios that we have never encountered before. But the key question then is, what enables such learning? What is it that can allow us to go from this sensor input to world models, and where do we get supervisory signal for this? And one very popular paradigm that we have developed in the computer vision community is that of learning from annotations. For example, for any particular task that I'm interested in, for example, image classification, this paradigm says I should collect, let's say, 1 million labels for this task of interest. So if I want to learn image classification, one can go and collect a data set of the size of ImageNet, where for each image, we have made a human annotate the corresponding class label, And then we can learn this function that goes from some sort of observations to this prediction of interest, which in this case is class level. Or for example, if we are interested in a different task, that is the task of finding objects and their boundaries, we can again collect a different data set, in this case, let's say MS COCO, again of the scale of 1 million annotations. And then that can allow us to learn this function that can go from sensor input to the output of interest, which in this case is instance segmentation. But the task that we are interested in here is to go from some sort of sensor input to a physical representation of the underlying world. That is, if I see a table, I should be able to make guesses about the friction coefficients, about the masses of objects on it, and so forth. And the issue with this paradigm is that it doesn't really scale to this problem of being able to perceive physical models, because annotations of such physical properties are often impossible, or sort of at best going to be very, very costly to scale up. This is not how we humans or any real agent in the natural world really learns. It doesn't learn about the world through such costly annotations. It simply learns about the world by just interacting with it and using the data it observes from this interaction as its own supervision. And to therefore operationalize this slightly more ecologically plausible way of learning, what I want to propose is that we should not really rely on annotations, but rather rely on what I would call a prediction consistency. And so again, we want to be able to go from some sensor observations to some mental world models. Instead of requiring annotations, is there a question? But instead of requiring annotations, the key insight is that this world model that we are predicting is a model of the underlying physical world. And this physical world obeys certain laws of physics that we are aware of. And these laws of physics can let us induce certain observations. So for example, if I see a table and predict a particular configuration of blocks, then I should be able to predict what effect certain forces will have, or whether that configuration is stable or whether it will fall down or not. And I can do this using just the laws of physics that I know. And these laws of physics can therefore let us induce certain, what I'd call verifiable observations, which can provide us some form of supervisory signal to learn prediction of these world models. So I'm just drawing this very toy diagram of a certain learning approach, and I'll go into certain projects that operationalize this in different scenarios. But at a very high level, what I want to argue for is that we shouldn't really rely on annotations to learn about predicting the underlying physical models or to perceive the underlying physical structure of the world, but rather just enforce that whatever physical models we predict should obey the laws of physics that we know and agree with certain observations that we can verify. And I want to first sort of ground this idea in a concrete project. And towards that, here's just a video of, I'm not entirely sure if it's me or Abhinav, but one of us interacting with this particular object. And if we were to think of what a current perception system will output for this particular video, it might output a certain label that the person is holding an object or a person is lifting an object. But across all of these videos, the way we are interacting with the object actually differs significantly, right? For example, in one of them, the places where the hand is in contact with the object differs, the way the hand is applying forces on that object, or the rotations that the hand is initiating in the object differ significantly across all these motions. But a system that is aware of only semantics will perhaps label all of these as a lifting or a holding interaction. But if we want a robot to be able to understand these videos, then it should really understand what is happening at a more physical level. And so towards this, we were interested in this task that tries to understand the physical reality underlying those videos. So given an input video where a person is interacting with an object, we want to be able to understand this video at a physical level, or sort of to be more concrete, we want to be able to tell what forces were applied to the object at each time step to induce the motion that we just saw in the video. And sort of this sort of physical understanding is really desirable if a robot wants to, let's say, imitate the motion that we want to imitate, certain motion that we showed to it, but it's extremely difficult to annotate. Just as I was showing earlier, we cannot really annotate across all of these examples what precise force a person applied at each of the time steps. So to study this problem, what we did was collected a data set of about sort of 200 videos where we were interacting with some of these known objects from the YCB dataset, and with sort of approximately 13,000 frames. And in each of these frames, we sort of, as I said, the eventual goal is to be able to infer some sort of forces that were applied to this object. And one way that one would think of is that we can use some sort of force sensors, that on this object, we'll put a lot of force sensors to record the ground truth interaction that the person did. But unfortunately, this is not very feasible because the force sensors are often not precise, and they would change the way you are going to interact with this object because they're very clunky. And so this way of collecting annotation is not very feasible for this task of interest, that is, we want to predict the forces that a person applied at each time step. And so instead, what we can label is not the ground truth forces, but rather certain key points that for this particular object at this time step, its handle was here, and so on. So for example, for this particular drill, we manually defined certain key points, sort of point 1 to point 10, for example, and asked people on Mechanical Turk to label the location of these 2D key points across many frames. And in addition to these key points, we also asked them to sort of label where the person's finger is touching the object at some of these keyframes. And what you should really note is that these defined key points are indicative of object pose. So in this interaction data set, what we have is videos of people interacting with the object, where we have an idea of how the object is itself changing, because we have sort of annotations for object pose across time, but we do not have any supervision for what exact forces that person was applying, or how exactly the object was being lifted, what physical forces were being applied at each of these contact points, which is what we want to be able to infer. So again, the goal is, given a video, we want to be able to predict where the person is touching the object and sort of where the person is making contact to induce motion in the object, and also what physical force is being applied at each of those locations. And it's extremely difficult, as I said, to get ground truth annotations for these physical forces. But what we can instead do is, because these are physical forces being applied on an object that we understand, that we have some sort of a 3D model of, we can simulate the effects of these forces. So given particular forces that are, let's say, predicted by our learned model, we can simulate their effects and imagine what states these predicted forces would lead to. And then we can simply say that these imagined states, these simulated states, should match the observed states, or the observed key points that we have annotated in our dataset. So given an input video, we have a model that predicts the forces in the contact points. And based on this, we can just simulate the effects of the forces. And as supervision, we can say that the predicted locations of the key points under our simulated effects should match the true annotated locations of the key points. And this can allow us to learn without requiring ground truth supervision for these forces, where we only have ground truth labels for these contact points and sort of these 2D key point locations, but no supervision for the precise forces. But we can still train the system to predict the physical forces that it sees in this new video. And here are actually one maybe neat trick is that we need this physics simulation to be differentiable so that we can train the system end to end. And one maybe slightly neat thing was, because this is a very low dimensional system, the state simply is the location of the object and sort of the angular velocity, etc. We could actually just use finite differencing through a standard simulator like PyBullet, and this was a pretty efficient system to train, and we didn't really require any cleverness in terms of defining a differentiable physics simulator. Just finite differencing on standard sort of non-differentiable physics simulators still allowed us to learn because of the low dimensionality of the state space. But essentially, this overall framework can let us just train using videos with 2D key point annotations and still learn this sort of force prediction. And just as an example on some new videos that are from the test set and were not really trained on the left I'm showing the video, and on the right is the trajectory that is simulated as a result of the forces that a network infers. So it's not precise, but you can see that it realizes that the object is being lifted or rotated, etc. And we can infer forces that more or less cause the desired motion. You'll see that the forces that we infer are sort of not very well regularized, and that was because we didn't explicitly enforce biases that the forces don't change rapidly, which is why the network discovered certain solutions where things change more rapidly than they perhaps should. But it's still interesting to see that given just these videos, it can figure out solutions for what forces to apply such that it can cause the desired motion. And sort of it does so reasonably well across many different objects. And I'm not sure. And one other slightly interesting result is that we have this sort of dual prediction where given a video, we are predicting where the hand is making the contact and what forces it's applying. And while we have some supervision for the contact points based on the 2D annotations, the quality of these contact points really benefits from the joint training with also sort of simulating the effects of the predicted forces. And so that's what's shown on the right. On the right are predictions of contact points where contact point prediction and force prediction are both trained together end to end, whereas in the middle is the result of the contact point prediction when it's trained on its own using just the 2D annotation. And we see that leveraging the physics, sort of the physics of the videos or the physics of the motion does benefit also the contact point prediction in addition to allowing us to predict meaningful forces. And yeah, here's maybe just one particular result where on this particular skillet, if we just use the 2D supervision for the contact points, it doesn't predict very well, but also using the fact that these contact points are where certain forces will be applied leads to more meaningful predictions. And yeah, I'm happy to take any questions on this project before I move on, if there are any.
I have a question, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any plans on how this would transfer to a gripper? Right, like right now you have these forces being applied to these different contact points,
Mm-hmm.
And now I wonder, okay, if I have a I don't know, a 2-finger gripper or a 3-finger gripper on my robot arm, how would you transfer this over?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and we were actually thinking about that a lot when we did this project, whether we can at least define some manual mapping that, okay, given these forces on this 5-fingered hand, maybe we can define a manual mapping to a 3-fingered gripper. So that is one possible solution. But actually what is still sort of, there's a step in between actually. So I think the first step to consider is not a 3-fingered gripper, but still a dexterous hand, where right now we have not put in any additional constraints that the contact points that we infer are actually physically feasible given a dexterous hand. So right now the abstraction is that these contact points are arbitrary points on the object that can move around magically on the object and are not really modeled to be physically connected to a specific hand. So I think there's still an intermediate project in between, which is these inferred contact points and forces are still not directly applicable even to a dexterous hand, which has the same morphology as the human hand. So first we need to even study that and then look at sort of how one can generalize these inferences to a more general gripper. Towards which I think one can start with a manual mapping and then try to learn some basic models of given this net. So given these predicted forces, you have a notion that, you know, on this object, I want a net force in this direction, or maybe components of force towards the side and up, and learn some simple mapping, which can try to predict how those forces can be achieved using a simple gripper. Just sort of throwing ideas off here.
Okay, and I guess, sorry, thanks for the answer. And I guess along similar lines, how would you do so? Like right now, you're not regularizing the forces that can be applied, and I think I saw in the video that comes with the paper that sometimes there are large forces that are applied on 2 points in opposite directions, which kind of like cancel each other out. Have you thought about like adding some regularization or just like an error term for like the magnitude of opposing forces or something like this?
Yeah, so actually there are 2 regularizations that I think are desirable, though unfortunately we didn't have a ground truth data set of forces to even benchmark against, which is why we didn't really investigate which regularizations help. But I think 2 regularizations that might be desirable are one, the forces themselves should be as sort of small as possible, which will maybe cancel out the effect you mentioned, that 2 large opposing forces. And the other is that there's some temporal consistency. You don't suddenly change forces across time. And I think both of these regularizations should be desirable to add, though we might need some alternate way of benchmarking using at least ground truth forces or ground truth force directions or something to validate whether these are helpful or not. Because all of these might still lead to similar, so this problem is a bit under constrained because many possible physical forces can induce the same motion. And in this paper, we were really evaluating using the quality of the induced motion, which might not show benefits of such a regularization.
Gotcha, thanks.
Okay, so taking sort of a step back, what I really showed to you in this project, and it's just a slightly different diagram of the high-level idea I was talking of earlier, was that given some sort of a visual input or images, we want to be able to predict some physical properties such as forces and contact points underlying the images or video we just saw. And towards this, we could use our knowledge about how physics works through this explicit simulator. So in this case, we used the knowledge about sort of effect of predicted forces and use that as a supervisory signal. But to explicitly use this physics, what we required was maybe the precise knowledge of the mass or friction of the object, and we needed to make some approximations of that. But to use these laws of physics explicitly, we needed sort of an explicit physical representation that the model is going to infer. And this may not always be feasible. In some cases, what may be desirable to do is also learn an implicit physics model that is inspired by our knowledge of the physics, that has the right sort of inductive biases, but is not explicitly enforcing the same structure that the parameters that the model infers are decomposed as mass, friction, forces, etc., but are a bit more implicit. And this can also allow us to learn in slightly more general scenarios with maybe additional priors such as the compositionality of the underlying world. And maybe just as an example of this, we were looking at how one can accomplish slightly longer horizon tasks. So for example, if I were to show you this particular image, which is the current configuration, and this other configuration, which is the goal configuration, and I want a robot to be able to manipulate this scene to go from the current state to the goal state, and sort of an additional constraint is that this robot can only push objects around. That's sort of the only action allowed to it. Sort of all of us will realize that the red block is not really moving, and it has to push the blue block around the red block to the desired configuration. And to do this, it needs to understand what effects its actions will have, and which is in some sense a forward physics model, but it's not really desirable if we want to predict. It's not ideal if we have to predict the explicit mass, friction, etc. for all of these objects. And so we might, instead of having an explicit physics model, might want to predict an implicit physics-based representation here. And sort of to accomplish this goal of what action sequence can let us go from a current observation to a goal configuration, we leverage this very standard framework of model predictive control, where given a forward model, where what that forward model predicts is given a particular embedding or a representation of the current observation and the goal observation, we have a forward model that lets us hallucinate the effects of different actions. So each of these purple arrows corresponds to a different action, and sort of the direction of the arrow implies a certain change in the representation of the embedding. And so given a forward model, this model predictive control framework really lets us search for what is a good action sequence or what is a good first action to take. And just to give a 2-minute overview for someone if you're not familiar, the model predictive control, the way it works is given a current and a goal embedding and a forward model, it essentially plans for a long horizon, which in this case diagram is sort of a horizon of 4, and then it executes the first action and then just replans. And what we really need to instantiate this framework is this forward model that can allow us to plan. And the current popular solutions for what a good forward model is, essentially there are 2 different approaches. One is based on more explicit physical representations where we can try to infer the precise physical parameters of the system, the mass of the objects, the friction coefficients, etc., and use those to infer the effects of a certain action or a certain push. Or alternately, we can have a fully implicit representation that, let's say, just abstracts out the entire scene as a single latent vector and then tries to learn a forward model in this fully implicit space. Instead, what we proposed to do was sort of a semi-implicit representation where we still keep around the structure of the scene, the notion that the scene has different objects, the objects affect each other, the gripper affects the objects, etc., and learn sort of an implicit object-centric forward model. And actually, I might skip some of the details in interest of the time, but at a very high level, we learn a forward model which has sort of a graph structure where we embed each object as a node, as well as this action AT or the gripper as a node, and then learn what the future configuration will be as a result of this action. And I'm skipping some of the details of the representation, but essentially what I want to emphasize is that this particular forward model can actually just be trained in a self-supervised way by random interactions. So what we did was had a robot with sort of many blocks on the table where the robot is just randomly pushing different blocks around and observing the new configuration of the scene as a result of each of its actions, and just collects this data set of 5,000 random pushes and the effects of each of those pushes. And based on just this, we can learn this forward model by saying that we have a current image, IT, for which we have a certain representation that we are learning, as well as this forward model, which gives us the representation at the next time step. And all we say is that this representation should allow us to recover the image that we observe at the next time step. So just by randomly interacting with the world and seeing the effects of different actions AT on how that induces the next image IT plus 1 given IT, we can learn both this representation function as well as the future prediction, this sort of forward model P that we can subsequently learn for planning. And what's sort of really the main thing that makes it work is this decomposition, or the idea that this representation is composed of multiple objects that interact with each other and the robot. And this inductive bias lets us really learn a good forward model that, and again, I'm going to skip some of the details, and we can obviously recursively keep using this forward model that given a current image, we need not necessarily supervise the immediate next image, but can actually supervise an image that is, let's say, 10 steps away by unrolling this prediction model for 10 time steps. And what this can eventually allow us to do is, given this initial location and the goal location, I'll first show results of a baseline which does not have this object-centric decomposition, and it doesn't really understand perhaps that these objects move differently, or it should really push the blue object away and not really affect the red object, and doesn't take very informative actions. Whereas our model does understand the notion of these objects and that it should not really push the blue object onto the red object, but kind of make it move around. And I might have some more examples of this with perhaps similar examples where there are 2 objects, and in the left are some examples with a real robot, and on the right are some more simulated settings where we updated certain aspects of the method. But at sort of a very, taking one step back, being able to just randomly interact with the world, we can learn some implicit physics-based representation of how the world changes as we act. And then this can really allow us to efficiently plan and achieve certain goals that are slightly long term. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take them now as well.
I had a question. So do you know the work, the visual foresight work from Chelsea Finn's group? And if so, like, is this, this seems pretty similar, or how is it?
So actually the baselines that we were comparing to, the one from Friedrich Ebert, was actually a follow-up on the visual foresight work. And I'd say the main distinctions are in the visual foresight work, the inductive bias that's there is that transformations are more or less local and given an action. So the forward model is more flow-based. It doesn't impose a compositional bias. It imposes a local flow-based transformation bias. Whereas in our case, there's a more object-centric bias that the world is really decomposed into objects which affect each other. And we found that our model can better capture interactions that cause more motion. So each of these pushes is actually in terms of if you think of the raw number of pixels was causing a motion of 40, 50 pixels for the object. And that is not very easily modeled by things like visual foresight, which only predict local flow.
Okay, that makes complete sense. I have another question. It's like maybe a little cheeky, but I noticed with all the experiments in this sort of type of work that they tend to be like very easily visually distinguishable objects from the background.
Yes.
I mean, and I assume that that's important. So what would it take to get a method like this to be able to, like to really scale to cluttered scenes or scenes where there's a lot more like visual disturbances or distractors?
So I think that maybe there's a slightly broader question there as well, right? Because in this work, what we were learning, everything that we were learning was in context of just this raw pushing data itself. And at least I do think whenever we humans are interacting, there are a lot of priors. We already have knowledge about what objects are, etc. So to really learn in more challenging scenes, I don't think an approach which is learning everything from scratch using just these pure raw interactions, it's also learning about objects, etc., is going to work very well. I think we do need to build in biases of what objects are, or using certain recognition data sets, bring in knowledge about good visual features that can let us track correspondences. And if we can do that, then I think all of these approaches that I was talking about would scale. But I do believe some more prior knowledge or prior notions of what objects are kind of critical. And the fact that, we only show these in these simple scenarios is because in these simple scenarios, those priors, etc., need not be learned. They're like pretty trivial to learn.
Makes sense.
Okay, so far what I was focusing on in my talk was really the perception part, the sort of idea that given sensor input, we should predict some sort of models of the underlying physical world, sort of in some sense implicit or in some cases explicit, that can subsequently allow us to act to accomplish certain goals. And the way we were learning these world models was really by interacting with the world in the second project, just randomly, and making sense of those random interactions, learning about the world from these random interactions. But there's also an orthogonal question which is interesting, which is if we want to be able to learn perception that is eventually useful for interaction, how do we go about collecting information for learning this? As in, what kind of interaction can allow an agent to sort of collect meaningful or interesting data such that it can then learn about the world? And one of the most common answers for what actions an agent should take that is used these days is, let's define an extrinsic reward, some reward that is dependent on the eventual goal or the eventual task, and learn a policy that can optimize that extrinsic reward. And so this pursuit of extrinsic rewards is what has led to many, many successes or many of the headline making papers that you might have seen. For example, agents that can beat sort of the world's best players in certain games, or exceed human performance in Atari. Or there was this a bit more recent example from OpenAI where it could even learn things like hide and seek using pretty simple task-based rewards, or things that are a bit more closer to some of the things that might be of interest to roboticists, that dexterous manipulation, for example. But across all these examples, we have these hand-designed rewards which really shape the behavior or really shape the kind of actions that an agent is taking. But sort of unfortunately, in the real world, that is very hard to come by. If we think of, again, the robot that is supposed to clean my house or bring me coffee, it's extremely difficult to define very dense rewards that can really drive the behavior of that agent. Or it's extremely difficult to define rewards that can let the robot take interesting actions. And so maybe some of you might have seen this slide from Alyosha or Deepak that there's a kid who eventually wants to become a pilot or wants to learn about the world. There are no extrinsic rewards that are given to this kid. He just acts on his own and does interesting things. And so there's this alternate view that many people have proposed, which is instead of using extrinsic rewards, try to leverage some sort of intrinsic rewards, that the agent comes up with its own reward function and tries to learn a policy that optimizes this kind of an intrinsic reward. And sort of if you do a literature search, there are, this is perhaps dating back to Schmid-Huber's paper on intrinsic motivation. There's a very long line of work on what kind of intrinsic rewards one can use. But all of these papers that I've listed in these slides and many more that I've not really had the space to list, treat the sensor input as just sort of a single vector, that it's some arbitrary high dimensional input that's given as an input to the agent, and from that it's supposed to do whatever it wants to. Whereas in reality, the sensor input that any agent gets is very rich and multimodal. For example, I don't think sound on Zoom works very well, so there's no sound in this video, but any baby just sort of really plays with an object that makes this sort of jingling sound as he's moving around, and that sound is what really makes the baby move his or her arms more, just because he wants to hear what happens. And here I'm not really showing the full video, but subsequently there'll be other multimodal sources as well, that the baby will probably lick this toy as well to see how it feels in a certain different sense. So the main point that I'm getting at is the world is really multimodal, and the sensor input that we get is not really just visual, but it's a plethora of many different modalities such as audio, haptics, etc. And any agent gets all of them together, and the intrinsic reward that we define should really exploit this fact. It should not treat the sensor input as a monolithic vector, but really exploit the fact that we experience the world in many rich and multimodal ways that are complementary. And so towards sort of how we can do this, how we can leverage the multimodality of the world, we can first look at one of the more popular formulations for intrinsic reward, which is this sort of a future prediction error. So given current sensor input and an action that will happen, sort of action that is being taken, a very popular formulation is to define this prediction error as an intrinsic reward. And if one were to think of how one can incorporate multimodality in this, we can, for example, think that given current action and sort of observation from one modality, we should be able to, let's say, predict another modality. However, I'd argue that this sort of idea of using prediction as a reward has some fundamental limitations. For example, it's very difficult to precisely predict, let's say, what sound will happen if we are just looking at visual input. And alternately, there's also some inherent stochasticity in the world. And maybe just as a very toy example of this, if I were to give you a button which stochastically makes one of two sounds, you'll never be able to precisely predict what sound will happen, even though you have sort of understood that it will just be one of these sounds. But any of these models that wants to precisely predict the effect of an outcome will sort of fail at this kind of stochasticity, where, let's say, one particular action can lead to two different possible sounds. And so by exploiting sort of more specific to the multimodal nature of the task that we are interested in, what we observed was that the notion of prediction is not really necessary. Instead of predicting sort of what sound will occur given the current image and action, we can simply reframe this as an association task. That is, we can just try to learn whether this audio-visual pair is something that will naturally occur or not in context of the action. And this actually goes back to one of Andrew Owens and Alyosha Efros's papers where they were learning visual representations, but we can leverage similar ideas for learning these models that can let us explore. So actually, we might have a few minutes left. So what we can do is, given an interaction clip of an agent, let's say playing Atari games in this case, we can look at audio-visual pairs that are aligned and say that they are the co-occurring pairs. And we can look at audio-visual pairs that are misaligned and say that they are sort of negative pairs or misaligned pairs. And we can just train a prediction function that learns whether or not a particular audio-visual pair is aligned or not, using just aligned or misaligned examples as positives and negatives, with some sort of tricks about weighting that I'll maybe skip. But given this model that has learned whether things are associated or not, we can just define novelty of a new experience that we have as our predicted misalignment value. So if we are interacting with the world and we see an audio-visual pair that we are not sure whether it's aligned, then that means it's something new. That means it's something that we have not experienced before, and we can be curious about it. So we can just learn this association model in a self-supervised way by using positives, aligned examples as positives, misaligned ones as negatives, and just use our confusion on new real pairs that we see as a way to drive intrinsic exploration. And we show this across a few different environments. For example, we can learn to play Atari games, where on the left is just a pure visual curiosity baseline, and on the right is our method that uses this sort of multimodal association-based curiosity. And I mean, the baseline does reasonably well, and actually this is probably one of the games where both of them do comparably well. But what we see is that our agent tries to play kind of really, really fast, perhaps because it likes to hear more and more audio as the bricks are kind of eaten, or I don't know what the right word is. And we sort of ablated this across many different Atari games and saw that our method, which is shown in blue, does comparable or better than the visual prediction baseline, sort of better in 7 of the 12 games that we studied. And that in fact, both of them are kind of complementary. And what we can actually do is just combine our prediction, sort of our association-based curiosity with the standard visual prediction-based curiosity and get essentially the best of both worlds, and sort of get a method which complements the pure visual prediction-based curiosity and improves over it in almost all of the environments. And actually skip some of the experiments on noise robustness. But I think what we were much more excited about were not results on these Atari games, but arguably slightly more realistic settings where we can look at indoor navigation. So we instantiate the agent in a new environment where there's a sound source. So you can think of, there's a speaker somewhere in the house which is constantly emitting sound, and the agent is going around this particular house. And so naturally, just by different geometry of different local environments, it hears slightly different sounds at different locations. And just this can allow the agent to learn exploration. So we use this audio habitat environment released by Kristen Grauman's group in ECCV, and use this for studying exploration in this navigation setup, and spawn our agent with a fixed sound source in the environment, and just compare our method across many baselines, which use purely visual curiosity, and explore how well different baselines explore. And so, sorry, this is a slightly complicated curve, so I'll try to walk you through it. But on the y-axis, we are plotting the visitation count at each of the grid locations. So this map, you can think of as being partitioned in different grid locations. And so the x-axis is a sorted sort of index of those grid locations. And on the y-axis, we are measuring how often we visited that grid location. So if a method optimally explores, then the curve would be sort of flat, because if a method is optimally exploring, it's visiting each of these different cells the equal number of time. And a method, so sort of our method, you can see that visits the less visited states much more often. So for example, if we think of the 1/50th least visited example, we visit it almost 10 times as much as the baselines. And so that tells us that our method, which is using this multimodal associative curiosity, is a bit better than all of these baselines at exploring these indoor environments. And we also had some visualizations showing this as a heat map. And what you should really see is that there should be very few white or light red regions, because white or light red implies that that region was not very well explored. So maybe just to highlight certain regions across all of the baselines, that these are the regions that the baselines fail to explore well, whereas our method does do a reasonable job of exploring, which is the one on the top left. And yeah, so I think with that, I'll just go back to, again, the high level picture that, when we are thinking of interacting with this physical world, what we should keep in mind is that the sensory input that an agent will have will be sort of multimodal. And given this, the role of perception is to recover some sort of world models that can allow you to act, but that these actions themselves can help us learn better perception models by some sort of using some of these intrinsic rewards that I showed, which leverage the multimodality of the sensor input. And sort of, I do hope that this toy diagram is something that is helpful in our quest for building more intelligent agents, that where we really build agents that perceive the physical structure of the underlying world and also interact better so that they can learn this perception better. Yeah, with that, I'd like to thank you for having me here, and I'm happy to take more questions.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Ray here. I have a question about the settings in the curiosity thingy, the she method, I think.
Yeah.
Is the heat map that you show, is that like coverage during training or test time?
Yeah, so in all of these, and sort of similar to Atari, there was no testing. It was more that we have spawned the agent in this environment, and it's just exploring based on its curiosity. So it is just, these are just training heat maps. Sort of similar to Atari, we only see these training behaviors, right? That given a new environment, how efficiently are you exploring that? Sort of not given a new environment, given an environment, how efficiently are you exploring the state space?
Okay, so during the exploration, do you also update the policy at the same time using?
Yeah. So across all of these methods, the way these heat maps or plots are constructed is we say that all methods are allowed to explore for sort of a fixed number of epochs, and sort of not a fixed number of iterations, and they're constantly updating their policy during training, and we are just recording how often they visited each of these states.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
So yeah, I sort of have a question in the second project that you presented, where or perhaps yeah, the second one where you're trying to learn forward models.
Yeah.
So there was one pre-training phase or so, if I understood correctly, where you just had random interactions, and from that you learn forward models.
Yes, so it was, I don't know if I'd call it pre-training. So the goal was to learn forward models, and the data for those forward models was attained through just randomly pushing objects around. But sort of that was the only training phase that happened.
So do you think there needs to be like a significant overlap between those random behaviors that you collect and like the end task? What if there's not much correlation?
Yeah, and so what you definitely do want is the kind of interactions that you have done are a superset of the things that might be relevant for your end task. And that, I think, is pretty important.
Like maybe a better way to phrase the question would be, is it fair to say what you're aiming for is sort of domain randomization, where you have lots and lots of trials as your interactions, and you want like the reality or the test runs to be like a specific case?
So I don't know if maybe domain randomization is the best way to think about it. Sort of in my mind, what we want to learn is the robot should understand what happens if I take this action. And if it has a certain task in mind, then the sort of actions that it will be querying will be from a relatively narrow domain. But if it understands what happens if I take this action for a broader set of actions, that's still okay. That's, I mean, so maybe it's more about, you want to understand at least implicitly, the physics or the dynamics of the world as you take certain actions. And at test time, you might only be taking a subset of actions, but you need to have seen enough data so that you can accurately predict for those.
Makes sense. Perhaps like a quick question on the audio-visual exploration end.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how is the environment like? Is it just one constant sound source placed at one location, or are there also distractors? Like in typical households, you might assume, confounding sources or.
Yeah. So in this case, it's actually just a static sound source at a fixed location. One thing we actually do discuss a bit in the text is the association method is robust to some distractors as long as there's some signal in the sound present. So because you're just learning this association prediction, so just think of, let's say half of the sound is always random and the other half of the vector is informative. The association model can just learn to ignore the first half, and that's sort of completely okay. Because it still lets it predict whether it's an aligned or a misaligned pair. Whereas a prediction-based approach will kind of get confused by this additional noise. So even though this was a pretty simple setting where there's a fixed sound source, the Atari games often do have background noise in addition to foreground noise. And that's still okay for the agent.
Fair enough.
Yeah, really like the talk. I completely subscribe to your like high level view of the joint like consideration of perception and action, and these are some nice like steps in that direction. I guess, what do you think is next? Like, what are the, so obviously that problem statement is like very general and very hard in general.
Mm-hmm.
But what do you think are some next concrete steps that we can take towards like learning representations that are useful for interaction?
Mm-hmm. So actually I have a couple of concrete thoughts and some more abstract thoughts, which I don't yet know how to operationalize. So sort of in the more concrete things, I think perhaps also goes back to the question you asked earlier, which is all of these are in pretty simple settings. And so there, I think we need to be able to leverage a lot of videos to also augment these kind of physical model perception and the effect of actions that we are learning. Like if I just go and watch YouTube, I'll get a lot of data of people lifting bottles, pouring things in coffee. And we should try to leverage those to learn about this physical prediction in more general settings. And sort of I hope and expect that that will be more useful to enable robotic interaction in slightly more complex settings. The slightly less concrete thing I want to have is sort of this approach. Sort of the second project that I showed predicted the effect of this very small action, like this small push, or even the first project I mentioned was predicting these forces at very small time intervals. But what we really should have a way of saying is, what's the long-term effect of a long-term action sequence? And in some sense, that's how humans plan that. I need to walk out of the house. And it's a more abstract action, and we think of a more abstract effect of it. And that is something I believe we need to accomplish longer-term goals, but I don't know how to formulate that very well. Like this abstraction of this very per time step action, I am not entirely sure it will chain very well or generalize very well to complex things.
Right. Yeah. Like I've seen some works more in the RL community that think about temporal abstraction as well, right? Like that at some level you need to think about things on the level of events, not on the level of like time steps, right? And that feels to me like it's about right in terms of a formalization, but I mean, there's still a lot of open questions there for sure. Other questions?
So yeah, we'll perhaps take one last question, if any.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So I'm referring back to your first project, the one where you're trying to predict physical interaction, the physical world. My question is tactile information inside your model or just visual information? Because you know how we see the world, we have color, we have shapes, we have movement, but force, the sensor on our body for force is our tactile information. Is how much force I put in my arms, is how much pressure is applied in my hands. That's important information to understand force, which is essential to understand physics. So did you consider that to include in your model?
So we not information about force. We did look at explicitly incorporating things like known contact and modifying the model such that is there as opposed to just a video that we're really touching the object at this location or not. But sort of the final model was purely visual, and the goal was there maybe a bit different, which is, let's say you can just see me lifting this bottle, right? And you sitting there can still infer that I am applying an upward force on this bottle, and these three fingers are applying some sort of an inward force because so that it doesn't fall down, etc.
But let's say for the hammer, how the hammer moves in the air, there's a prediction of how mass is distributed in the hammer, and
yes.
that's
all of those. I think we made a lot of very simplifying assumptions. So we always assume that the object is of a uniform density, which is not the best assumption.
Oh, okay.
And so sort of the goal was, given some knowledge about geometry of the object and these simplifying assumptions of known friction coefficients and uniform density, you just want to watch a video and predict what kind of physical forces can let you get to similar motions, which I'd argue is what you do. So the way you have learned about the physical world is by interacting with it. That I definitely agree, and using your force sensors, etc. But at the end of the day, you can watch me interact with this bottle and coarsely predict what I'm doing. And so that is what we were aiming for.
Yeah. But let's say I'm watching videos on YouTube and I've never interacted with the world. If I see like a clock, well, I don't know.
Is you interacting with the world?
I think the tactile information is really important. Maybe you should try to include it. It would certainly give a lot more precision to your model. It's just an idea I wanted to share. Okay.
Yeah, okay. It's a good point to consider. Thanks.
Yeah, maybe just on that front, like we also have another speaker, a very close friend of Shubham's, Laren, in a few weeks. I think his talk's going to touch upon tactile sensing stuff. Yeah,
I think he also might talk about some things on learning in more general settings using lots of interactions in the wild, which he told me not to talk about today. So yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So Thanks. Thanks for the talk, Shubham. It was really great having you, and also thanks for making the time to talk to a few students and so on. And yeah, next week we're gonna be hosting Ronald Clark. So that's going to be at the same time next week. Hopefully everyone can tune in. And thanks again, Shubham.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great listening. Bye.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.